One of my viewers had a question regarding a scene where the background is blown out and whether or not that is acceptable. There are two answers for this: absolutely, and it depends. He also questioned about aiming for a middle exposure to try and make the most out of the foreground and the background. This latter question depends on the lens, exposure, and dynamic range of the camera. Here's some footage with my GH4, which has 10 stops of dynamic range in its base configuration. Unfortunately, the camera was set to automatic, and it was a partly sunny day that wreaked havoc on the exposure. Even if I did set the exposure to balance the shot better, there simply wasn't enough dynamic range in the camera to deal with that bright background and the dark foreground. You can also see that if I do raise some of the values to get a passable foreground, then the background suffers. Because of the limited dynamic range, brightening the foreground elements also raises the noise values in the shadows. This isn't too hard to deal with using DaVinci Resolve's noise reduction capabilities, but it's another element to the workflow that adds time to the project. But the question here is, does it matter? Is what is presented in the foreground the focus of the scene? In this case, it is. In fact, if people are paying attention to the background, then I'm not doing my job in the foreground to keep their interest, or I'm not shooting it well enough to frame things properly so the focus is on the subjects in front. In this next shot, we have the GH4 exposed for brightness and clarity on the foreground characters. What they are doing is important for the scene, but you can see this blows out the background terribly. Does it matter? If you're making a well-rounded film where the background location was nearly as important to what's going on in the foreground, then perhaps you wouldn't be shooting with a GH4, or at least not without Vlog. Here's a shot with the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. You can see it clearly doesn't have the same dynamic range problems of the base GH4. Background and foreground elements are exposed in a pleasing way. The action in the foreground is nearly the same as in the GH4 shot. If you hadn't seen or didn't know about the Blackmagic camera's dynamic range and image quality for exposure, would the GH4 have been sufficient for conveying the information or feeling the video was intended to convey? Here's another look at a recent television scene from a series called Debris. The first scene has the character against an almost white background. Here, we see that the background is actually a city skyline, or at least that's what the effects shot for the scene implies. You can see the buildings behind the individual in the center, and here you can see those buildings aren't present at all. Again, most likely an effects shot, and some continuity missed, or it was simply a longer lens with a higher depth of field blur, which could also cause this effect, essentially making it look like poor dynamic range on the camera. Again, another shot where the depth of field blur could make it look as though it were shot on a camera with less dynamic range. But it also could be that, like in my GH4 shot here, the foreground elements were more important than the background elements. As with any film production, it all comes down to what you want to convey with the story, context, and emotion first. Then comes things like the focus of any particular scene, continuity, and whether or not the environment itself is an integral element to what needs to be conveyed with the story. Essentially, it all comes down to the director and the choices they make with the story at hand. I hope this helped anyone who was wondering about such things. Please hit like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this. Thank you.